Being understood is key for a leader to communicate what needs to be done. But even though English is spoken around the world, it doesn't mean it's understood in the same way. Let's take an example of Singapore. Singapore has 4 official languages. English is one of them. But often a North American that's going abroad to Singapore may speak in a team meeting, and find that nothing has been done following the meeting. Why? Because the team members have not understood what was said. So what does a U.S. citizen going abroad needs to be aware of and needs to implement to be sure that the people in his team understand his English or her English? Welcome to the Excellent Executive Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Katrina Berus, and today we are interviewing Heather Hansen. Heather, welcome.
Hi, Katrina. Thanks so much for having me.
So you're a specialist in communication. So tell us a little bit about the secrets to successful global communication. You're in Hong Kong. You deal with multinationals and in a multicultural environment. So what are the secrets to communicating across cultures?
Yes. Well, actually, I'm in Singapore, which is very similar to Hong Kong.
Sorry.
And makeup and international. Yes. But Singapore is incredibly international. And we have 4 official languages. Many people don't realize that English is an official language here. It's used in business. It's used in education, in the government. But we also have Mandarin, Malay, and Tamil, which is an Indian language. And everything that comes from the government, for example, is 4 sheets of paper and all the translations. So in addition to having all these different ethnicities and language groups here in Singapore, we also have a massive expat community that makes up a large part of the business community here. So all the business that we do and all of our conversations are typically in English as a lingua franca, a common language. And I know that you're from Switzerland, so it's a very similar type of situation, right? Where we are speaking across languages and cultures all the time.
Yes, in a country like Switzerland, where they have 8 million people, there's 4 official languages: French, English, German, and Romansh. So yes. 4 languages as well. So how do they handle these 4 languages in Singapore and in business?
Yeah. So when we're looking at this kind of cross-cultural communication, and every single conversation we're in here is that kind of cross-cultural, only 6 million people here, right? And this little teeny island, but we all use English, but we have to use it in a very different way. So when we look at speaking in global environments, it's very different than if we were sitting here having coffee in the US somewhere and using all of our cultural expressions and idioms, and we speak really quickly and very conversational. But in global business, we have to change that. So part of it is the language and the way that we speak the language itself by removing cultural specifics and idioms, these little phrases like the whole 9 yards or touch base with you next week, hit it out of the park. These are all very much American sports analogies that we can't expect people from other cultures to understand. Not even other native speakers from the UK or Australia will necessarily understand those. But more than just language, it's about being very self-aware of your own culture, how it has influenced you in your upbringing, what kind of biases it's given you, so that when you are in conversations with others, you're not being biased and not listening because, they have an accent that for some reason triggers you, or they speak in a way you don't understand, or, their culture is so different, or there are so many different things. So we have the self-awareness piece, but we also have to be more conscious of their culture.
Give us
a
few examples of biases that you have witnessed of, let's say, an American coming in to Singapore and speaking to a local person.
Yeah. This is a very touchy subject, I have to say. And one of the very big ones that I've spoken about a lot, I've done a TEDx on this topic as well, is very much tied to accent bias. We need to understand that being born into the English language is an enormous privilege. enormous. We are so privileged when we go out into the world because we can speak without having to consciously think about the language itself. And many of our international colleagues have reached that level in their English skills as well, but they're few and far between. I'm so amazed that you can sit there in America and you can do a podcast in what is not your native language. I'm a very different person if I speak Danish, even though I'm fluent in that language. My husband's Danish. I've lived in Denmark, but I don't have the same confidence. So what happens very often is we have, the white Westerner coming in, typically in a leadership role. There's still a lot of colonial mindset left in both Singapore and Hong Kong, for that matter. And in that leadership role, coming in saying, well, this is my language. I'm the good speaker. You're the one that needs to speak in a way that I can understand. And we have a lot of bias around that. We hear an accent and we think, their English isn't very good. They're not very well educated. We have ideas about socioeconomic standing. And this isn't just a native, non-native issue. We see this inside of America, right? I have a good friend from Alabama. She moved to New York to work on Wall Street. You can imagine the way people discriminated against her. She was seen as the Southern belle. They called her Pollyanna, she's so sweet and has this cute accent, but she isn't very smart. She's not very forceful. She can't make her mark here. And we do this across culture as well. Really, cross-cultural is just interpersonal. It's just difference. And we do it whether we're in our own national culture or across the larger cultures. So we have to be very careful when we are the American going into this environment that we're in a global environment now. The English is different. The cultures are different. We can't expect to behave and speak in the way we normally would if we were home, if that makes sense.
So you have to make a conscious effort to speak pure English and no colloquialism.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's hard for a lot of native speakers because those colloquialisms are so built into our conversation. I even slip all the time. As I was writing my most recent book, I actually went through and tried to edit all of those idioms, sayings, phrases, colloquialisms, tried to pull them all out and translate them. And sometimes I was stuck, like touch base. Okay, how do I even translate that? We say it all the time. Okay, I'll call you next week instead of I'll touch base with you next week, or I'll send you an email. We have to be very specific and mourn your enormous SAT vocabulary as well. A lot of people are very proud of their eloquence, proud of their vocabularies. We see it as a mark of education, of being well-read. But when you go out into the world, you have to adjust and accommodate to your listener. And if they haven't taken the SATs and they haven't had to read all of the books that you did for your PhD, then they aren't necessarily going to understand the language that you're using. So we have to know how to balance that and meet people where they are so that we can make real communication happen.
So how have you found the consequences of people that come with colloquialism and very educated English? What are the consequences when you're trying to communicate across culture?
Yeah, the big problem is, and especially here in an Asian context, here in Singapore and throughout Southeast Asia, due to cultural differences, your team members are not necessarily going to say, sorry, I don't understand that, because they're losing face. It means that, they've done something wrong. They aren't smart enough. They aren't good enough. Their English isn't good enough. They aren't doing a good enough job in their work. They should be able to understand their boss. So they'll all sit there and nod and say, yes, okay, good. And then walk out of the room and nothing will get done the way that you just asked for it to be done. There is obviously a miscommunication and misunderstanding happening. And you're walking out going, what just happened? I was so clear. I'm speaking perfect English. Why aren't these people understanding? Well, they must have poor language skills, or they aren't educated enough, or they don't know their job well enough. And that's where you see the bias come in, because that's not the case at all. The real problem was that you thought you were being clear. You were being clear in an American sense, but you were not being clear for a global audience.
So what do you advise to an American that comes to Singapore and has these issues, doesn't realize they're speaking with American English and colloquialism? What advice would you give them to verify whether the other person has really understood?
Oh, that's a great question, because typically what people say is, does everyone understand? Everyone good? You're good? Okay, great. Awesome. See you next week. And that is not checking for understanding, because everyone will just say, yes, 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 boss. Absolutely. We're good. And they go off on their own and do something very different from what you were hoping. So checking for understanding is not asking, does everyone understand? You have to go around the room. Okay, what are your action items for this week? What have you understood from this meeting? What is your next step? I want to hear from everyone. Are we on the same page? There you go. Perfect example of an idiom. Do we all have the same understanding? So going through and around that room to make sure everyone has articulated exactly what they plan to do moving forward, so that you know they have truly understood your message. And that is if you are coming from a leadership perspective. Perhaps you are not the leader of that meeting and you're within the team. And then you can play other roles to help include people who have been left out of the conversation, to make sure everyone's voices are heard. I mean, the inclusion part is an entirely different piece of the puzzle. But from the leader's perspective, it's about really checking for understanding, not just saying, everybody got it? Good. We're good. It doesn't work like that. It does not work like that at all.
So how does this impact hiring decisions?
Yeah, it's actually very, very scary. There have been studies done looking at the language biases of hiring managers. So someone walks in the room, they have what you as a manager believe is a heavy accent. And that could mean anything. Believe me, when I have HR people call me and say, this person has such a heavy accent, no one can understand them. And then I speak with them and I think, their accent is perfectly clear and intelligible. So a lot of that is very subjective. It has to do with how much contact we've had with global varieties of English and accented English. So that's very, very subjective. But someone comes in, they have an accent. Now, you need to be so aware of your internal biases, because if you think about Hollywood films, for example, what do the bad guys sound like? The villains never sound like the hero American voice, right? The villains have accents. They have German accents. They have Russian accents. They have Eastern European in general, Arab. They never sound like us. We use language and accent as a divider, as a wall that we put up to say us versus them. You do not belong. You're different from me. So if you're sitting in a hiring situation, what the studies have actually shown is that people will not be hired at the same level as someone who does not have accented English. Now, all that means is that the accent doesn't match the manager, because everybody has an accent. I have an accent. So for me, accented English is anybody who doesn't sound like me. So anyone who comes in the room, depending on the personal biases I have, I may not think that person is as highly educated. I may not feel that I connect with the person as well. And it has nothing to do with any of that. It has to do with the fact that I'm biased against that particular person's accent, the way that they speak. And I'm not truly listening to the message behind it, but I'm listening to the accent and saying, oh, this person's never going to get along in my team. And oh, I can't even listen to this person. And that's what's really happening.
So sometimes you go abroad, like I've been to India to give a speech, and there's some Indians that I understand perfectly, and some Indians that never been abroad that I have a lot more difficulty understanding. Now, it takes a while to even if you focus all your concentration to get used to a very heavy accent.
Yeah, it really has to do with how much contact you've had. And you're right. India is a very good example because there's a very wide range of accents and they're slightly different. And depending on where they come from, there are so many Indian languages. I don't think people really understand that there are so many different languages. It's not just everybody speaking Hindi. Believe me, there's hundreds of different languages, dialects, everything. And so their accents in English can be different, first of all. And then depending on how much contact we've had. Now, from an American perspective, most people's contact with Indian accents has been through call centers. That is the primary place that we have heard the accent. Now, the problem with that is that that's usually a very negative experience. You're going into the call because you have a complaint, you have a problem, and then you're listening to an accent that's difficult for you to understand because you don't have a lot of access or contact to that accent. You haven't heard it before. And so we start equating that particular accent with very negative emotions, and that creates that bias. And when we go into other conversations like, oh, it's just so hard to understand. The Indian English is so difficult. And this is really a global issue because I hear it from every direction. Indian English is so hard. They speak so fast. They actually don't. What they do is they break the messages down in different ways. The way they chunk their words is different, and the way they use their intonation is different. So they'll go up on words in their voice that we typically wouldn't. We think they're stressing a word, they're not. And then we're still stuck on why did they stress that word? And then we think we misunderstood, and then they've moved on. So it really is something that has to be trained. And you're right, a lot of people are just tired. Our brains get tired when we hear accented English, and that makes us turn off. It's like, this is too hard. I don't want to work so hard to understand. And we have to really make the effort to tune our ears. When you start listening to very different varieties of English, you start to notice patterns. So you'll find that, for example, the TH sound. If you're not a native English speaker, that sound is typically pronounced a million different ways, S, Z, F, V, it can be anything really, a T or a D, and depending on your native language. And a lot of native speakers, I'll hear this in Singapore, we'll be sitting at a conference and a native speaker next to me, why can't he just say the? Well, because he's not a native English speaker, that's how it works. But when you understand the patterns that, okay, TH is replaced by a D or TH is replaced by a T, it's going to happen every single time for that speaker. And you start looking at it as this code. It's just a code that you're breaking as you start listening. It's, okay, so they pronounce TH as D for these words and T for these words. And, okay, they pronounce the sound is more of an eh. Okay, I got that now. Now I can figure that out. And that's actually what we're doing. But it takes a lot of time to tune your ear. When I landed in Singapore, I could understand no one. I didn't realize that the English spoken here was so different from British English because I knew they were an old colony. I kind of expected they would sound very British. They have a huge British influence. Same with Hong Kong. But they've developed their own very distinct variety of English. And it took me a good 3 months before I could really follow everything, because there is very different pronunciations, very different patterning, and a lot of other words from other languages that get blended in. I'm sure you can relate to that a little bit in Switzerland as well. The way the languages overlap and influence each other, it really affects especially the dialects that are spoken.
Right. Since there are 4 official languages in Singapore for 6 million people, each person's mother tongue, when they speak English, has a slightly different accent, I would suppose.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you can really hear if it's an Indian speaking English or a Malay speaking English or a Chinese speaking English, you'll hear those slight differences, and they have different styles, even though it's still all considered Singapore English. And they have different levels of Singapore English. So they have Singlish, which is very colloquial and really mixes a lot of Malay and Mandarin and Tamil. It mixes it all in. And then they have Singapore English, which is a more standard variety based on British English that's used in business and government and education. But they also encourage mother tongue education. So when they go through the school system, all the language is English, but they're required to take their mother tongue. And so if they are Chinese background, they'll be required to take Mandarin. If they're Indian background, they're required to take Tamil. So it depends on, they do try to maintain the languages as well, which I think is also important.
So
what
in
a sad
school,
world if we were all speaking only English.
In school, they're offered 4 languages, or they're obliged to have English plus the maternal language?
English plus the maternal language. Yeah. Okay. Assuming they're going to an English language school. You can still find some schools that are primarily Mandarin, but typically now the school systems are all in English, and then they are required to take a mother tongue class. Now, my kids are going to an international school, so there's the possibility to do a bilingual track. So they have half their courses in Chinese, half in English, or half in French and half in English if they'd like. I've put my children in the normal track, but they have Mandarin as their foreign language. And that's from first grade on. They start with Mandarin. So that's just built into the culture here, that the languages are taught and you have access to those languages.
How wonderful.
So what a gift, right?
Yeah,
what a gift.
I did an international baccalaureate as well, but so I was bilingual with French.
Exactly.
So some courses like history could be done in French, and philosophy in English, geography in French. So you really extend your vocabulary in 2 languages and flip back and forth from one language to the other, which is another skill. as well.
And it's such a gift to have that kind of international upbringing and be able to do that. I don't think people realize, and my children often don't realize what a gift it is, but I know that they will realize it as adults because it opens the entire world to you. And it also gives you a type of cultural understanding that you don't necessarily get as a monolingual, and a cultural empathy for understanding what it's like to learn another language. And that's, again, going back to your original questions about the American walking into the global environment. One of the big problems is that many of us as Americans, we don't speak other languages. And so we haven't had that experience of what it's like to struggle with another language and formulate our thoughts and how long that takes. And if we aren't at an extremely fluent level, you have that period of you need to kind of translate from one language to the other. And a lot of people in global business are still at that intermediate level where they aren't going to raise their hand really fast in the meeting because they're still formulating, how do I say this in English? And how is that the right word? And, they're struggling a little bit with that. So it's not that they don't have great ideas. It's not that they don't want to contribute. Sometimes it is a simple language barrier that could be holding them back. And we as Americans don't always recognize that because we think, oh, your English is so good, you must be fine. And why aren't you just speaking up? But because we don't understand, the monolingual Americans don't quite understand that process of what's happening in their minds as they're trying to articulate.
And Heather, what is Singapore doing to integrate all these different cultures, that they work seamlessly together?
It's really amazing. That's something I've been very, very impressed with since I first moved here in 2006. I've been here a long time. I had 4 years out. So 12 years total I've been here. And it's amazing. You walk down the street, you can see a mosque next to a Catholic church, next to an Indian temple. I mean, the races and ethnicities live in harmony. Now, that's not to say there isn't bias and there isn't kind of a ranking, because there is a very clear ranking of where which ethnicities are higher than others. That's very, very clear when you live here. And you can see that, which is dominant and which are not, which are respected more, which are not. But there is a lot done to ensure that we live in harmony. There is no negative talk about other people's ethnicities. We don't do that. There is a very strong hold by the government on the media and what is published. So there is a lot of censorship as well. So there is a very clear line about what is discussed in the media and things like that. So there is still very much that in place, which helps. But we also have public holidays for every religion. So we celebrate Christmas. We celebrate Chinese New Year. We celebrate Vesak Day. We celebrate Hari Raya. We have all of the different religious holidays and ethnic holidays that are typically linked with those languages. So for English, you can't really link language to religion, but the English part of that is coming from the British. So it is the Christian religion that is followed and what was brought by the colonizers. So that's why we have Christmas and Easter. We have Good Friday as a holiday here. So we have all of those, and the ethnicities and religions are treated equally. So that's, I think, one way that it's really built into the culture, that we all have respect for each other.
That's wonderful. Heather, we're coming to the end of our podcast. Where can people get a hold of you?
There are a few different ways. My company is Global Speech Academy, globalspeechacademy.com. And if they're interested in learning more about my most recent book, Unmuted, they can go to heatherhansen.com/unmuted to learn all about that, where I really talk in detail about all of these issues in global environments, global business, and global communication.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. Very, very interesting. And it reminds me in some ways of Switzerland and how they've integrated their 4 languages into the culture.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. We would love to know what you thought of this podcast. Write us an email at drkatrina with a K at excellentexecutivecoaching.com. We would love to hear what you liked and what we could improve. This podcast has been sponsored by excellentexecutivecoaching.com.
Thank you for listening to the Excellent Executive Coaching Podcast. You can subscribe to all future podcasts at excellentexecutivecoaching.com. Join us each Wednesday to learn more about the latest trends in leadership techniques and bring your coaching to the next level. To learn more about Dr. Burris' CEO Mastermind, use the contact form at excellentexecutivecoaching.com.